Now we are ready for the next talk, and next to the stage is David Mertz, that is going to talk about generative AI and specifically the attribution and the moral rights in generative AI. So I'll give the stage to David Mertz.
Thank you so much. And sorry for the bit of the mix-up in the schedule, but I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm going to, once I get a, oh no, that's not, there we go. There's the start of it. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And in fact, it's going to be a callback a little bit to what we were talking about in the question and answer period at the end of yesterday, where I raised the issue, and a number of people in the audience had interesting things to say about the kind of legal and juridical obligations that we feel like AI, especially generative AI, should have towards creators, like us as people who program code, but also, of course, other kinds of creators who make artwork or who write novels, who do other things in creative endeavors. And this is something that I think has been under-contemplated in legal frameworks and in general in the release of many of these tools which we're familiar with. So I want, as background a little bit, to talk about sort of what is the social picture about AI and generative AI in particular. And there's a couple points on this. On the one hand, I'll say just a few words about some of the sort of utopian ideas that are surrounded with these technologies. And there's definitely some that are very promising. Some of them we've heard presentations today and yesterday and elsewhere at exhibitors in this hall about really positive uses, things that are concretely useful, such as medical diagnostic tests, which may be improved in quality by using a variety of machine learning, AI kind of tools in order to get better diagnosis. Likewise, in a variety of areas of scientific research, whether it's from this wildlife management to molecular dynamics, a field I once worked in for a while, to astronomy, to a variety of other scientific areas where these kind of tools, these deep neural networks and other kinds of machine learning technologies are something that's very concretely useful. And this is kind of leading up to what this talk is actually about, where I'm going to focus on the issues of creator rights, more or less. One of the things where it might also be useful in this utopian vein is the way that many people use generative AI, the large language models in particular, as mechanisms for doing what search engines have done for a long time, but with some disadvantages, but also with some significant advantages. So you want some general knowledge about whatever the topic, maybe historical or literary or cultural knowledge, or you want knowledge about how to write some particular source code. These tools can often be very useful. So there is definitely this positive element that accompanies these technologies existing. But at the same time, I want to back up and think about why are these positive elements being advocated? And one answer is the obvious thing, that they are being advocated because they are in a concrete benefit. And that's the sort of official story, and that's what people want to focus on, as if this is like not historically located, and as if it is value neutral, what these actual advantages or what the implementation of these tools will do and where it comes from. But that's not true. As with any technology, it's something that always comes from a particular historical location and that always expresses the interests of particular groups of people who, are doing something with motives. And there's a variety of these. For example, there is this concern in evaluating these creator rights that I'm going to get into about what material should be made available for training generative models. Particularly, we can think of the large language models, which are very popular and get a lot of press nowadays. And there's a number of stakeholders here. Now, one stakeholder is somebody, I don't mean to single out just this one organization, but it's kind of representative to talk about the positions that have been taken by the Open Source Initiative, which is one of the groups that's advocated for free software or open source software. There's some nuance in the distinction between those particular two terms. But they haven't unambivalently taken one position, and this is certainly discussion that's continuing to go on within that organization. But in general, they come from this perspective of they want source code to be open. They want it to be shared. And in perhaps an overly crude analogy, they really take the same kind of thinking to apply to the training corpora that are going into creating these large language models or other kinds of generative models, where, in other words, they just want to create a legal environment where all the source code is available to go in to train these models under the thought that it makes the models as good quality as possible. I'm a little bit sympathetic with OSI and those kind of organizations. I'm certainly affiliated with many of the individuals and with many of the organizations that are in this line of thinking. At the same time, I think there's a certain kind of naivete to what they're doing. I think that they're not quite articulating what's actually different in creating source code that ideally is shared with other users of source code versus what's involved in creating content, which could be source code, that's going into training these much more complex models. Now, clearly the main stakeholders, the people who are really advocating for let's include everything in training these models, is the capitalist companies, the companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and Apple and Meta and other the big tech companies that you've heard of that are creating just such large language models, and they want to sell you some product that is going to derive from those models existing, and the fewer restrictions that exist upon them, the happier they are about the matter. So that's a sort of obvious motivation. It doesn't mean per se that they are wrong in their goal, like that we should necessarily oppose it, but it is important, I think, to contextualize it as what's actually motivating them. And another sort of utopian vision is just like, I write better code because CodePilot helps me write better code, which is true, and I'm not really disputing that. Certain caveats about where it can go wrong, some of which we discussed yesterday, but in general it does. On the same time, there's this flip side. There's a number of people who have concerns that are not exactly the concerns that I'm going to articulate in this particular talk, but that are to varying degrees legitimate. There's talk often about when are these machines going to become artificial general intelligence? When are they going to be equivalent to human beings or even smarter than human beings? And will they have motives of their own? Will we reach the Terminator, Skynet kind of world where the machines decide to take over the world and kill all of us humans? I'm not really concerned about that. I think that is a simplification that, I enjoy watching the movies that are about those kind of fictions, but it's not something that I believe is concretely a thing that we need to be concerned about. But at a smaller scale, there is a very concrete concern that I think is very realistic. And I think it's occurring, and I think that in order to address it, it has to be subject of regulation. We have to have laws. We have to have treaties. It's not enough to trust the good motives of the entities, whether they're large corporations for the most part, or even if they were nonprofit companies or consortia or whatever kind of other organizational structure that would create it, where there can be alignment problems. This is a bit of a coin of art, but the idea is that it can often be easier to specify what it is that we define as a goal relative to the optimization of the machine in a way that doesn't truly express our goals in creating the machines. When you say things to humans, you want them to do a certain kind of task. There's a whole lot of implicit or tacit knowledge that goes into that, where we kind of assume that they understand social realities and they understand ethical motives, and they, you know, maybe we don't agree with them about everything, but there's at least a whole lot of unstated assumptions that go into there. Whereas when you just sort of give the optimization function to a machine, that's not necessarily included, and you can create neural networks that in fact are very well optimized for the actual stated optimization problem, but it's not actually what we're trying to do. Now, some of the places where we get these grounded dangers, these things that are alignment problems that I think are very realistic, and again, I'm advocating that these have to be addressed by regulatory frameworks, by laws and treaties and things like that, is in areas like bias and toxicity. So we have these programs, they generate prose, for example, or they generate images too in a different kind of category of generative machines. And often they contain undesirable content. Perhaps they contain something that has, you know, a very racist meaning or a very misogynist meaning, or, you know, it has instructions on, you know, how to build a bomb or some other destructive technology. And those ideally shouldn't be included in the outputs of generative AI. And we need rules about not including those. There have definitely been some efforts made by some of the makers of these, some of these big corporations, where, you know, the worst of the worst examples have been recognized, and it just simply hurts their market position when their machines create such offensive content. But I don't think that's enough. I think we need actual rules that govern these things. But there's also another danger, I'm just going to switch hands here a little bit, where I think that there is a tendency, and this is a danger that we talked about even in the question and answer period yesterday, of coming to rely on these machines too much. This can probably happen in a lot of contexts. For example, one of the positive uses I mentioned just a few moments ago is something like medical diagnoses. However, if you completely put your trust in the machines to do the diagnoses without a certain kind of human oversight to that, that's, you know, potentially going to go the wrong way. There has to be kind of continuous monitoring, and there has to be human judgments. But another area that concretely speaks to me and to presumably the people in this audience is if I start to use one of these coding assistants all the time, maybe not me. I'm an experienced programmer. I read the code carefully. I evaluate whether it really does express my intention. But just as in the past, people would often, you know, copy paste the code from Stack Overflow, having no idea what it does, but okay, somebody else put it there, so it must be okay. I think that even to a larger extent, there's going to be a tendency that junior programmers, people learning, are going to, you know, see the code that's completed by the machines and assume it must be right. And as a consequence, we're going to get into production or even experimentation or whatever else, code that has certain kinds of characteristic flaws that AIs are likely to produce. I mean, what you can call hallucinations, but it's not really even narrowly hallucinations per se. It can just be a misunderstanding of like sort of the real goal behind the particular program. And, you know, as soon as you trust the machine rather than your own brain about evaluating the quality of the code, some bad things can get into code that we would rather not be there. Not to say that bad code isn't created in the absence of AI, but it worsens the danger in a certain sense. There's a social phenomenon, and I kind of want to coin this term, and I'm going to explain it to people for just a moment, where I see this going on already. I think there's something that I want to call blue washing going on. So there's a variety of dangers, some of which I've talked about as AI becomes more and more used. And very often we get a kind of sentiment from the stakeholders in creating these things, the big companies, the tech companies that are creating AI, where they want to, say, just trust us. We're going to consider all these ethical concerns, and the free market will win, and we'll do the right thing. I take this term, this portmanteau I made for blue washing, by analogy with several things. On the one hand, there's a weird little quirk, and this has existed for quite a long time, where if you do a search in a search engine, but also if you ask these generative programs, like the ones that do images, to draw you a picture of data science or artificial intelligence or a variety of terms that are, sorry about that, sort of in this vein, not quite inevitably, but you most often get pictures that are blue in tone, because for some reason data science is blue. And that's neither good nor bad, but it's just a sort of interesting curiosity. But the other part of it is I want to make an analogy with terms like greenwashing, which people may have heard, which is this idea that companies, in order to try to have cachet for people who have ecological or environmental concerns, will do advertisements and other kinds of statements where they market their particular product or service as somehow being an environmental advantage to use it. Now, whether or not there's any truth underneath that. And similarly, there's a term, pink washing, that's sometimes used, where in a very similar light, companies will market something with the intention of it being perceived as friendly to the LGBTQ community. They're gay-friendly and so on. Whether or not they've changed any actual company policies or the products they market or anything else, they just want to feel good to consumers by having, that overt appearance. And I think that it will exist in the future, but it's already started to exist, where concerns about dangers around AI are treated much the same way. Now, one example of this is this effort that was started maybe 2 months ago, something like that, called the Frontier Model Forum, which is basically a consortium of all of the big AI stakeholders, companies like Microsoft and OpenAI and Apple and Facebook and a variety of others, that released a press statement that said exactly this: we're forming this working group. We're going to think really hard about ethical issues. Just trust us. We're going to do the right things. We have very smart people. And whatever you do, don't pass laws that limit our behavior. And I think that's an example. Another thing that's, I believe, along this line is Adobe released a policy, again, about a month or two ago, that was about indemnification for images they produce in some of their tools that utilize these AI code image generation kind of capabilities. Now, the thing is, they're saying, basically, if somebody sues you when you use our tools to create an image and then you sell that image or utilize it in various ways, we're going to cover your legal costs. But Adobe is doing that because they are a holder of a large image library, and everything that their AI is trained on comes from their image library. So basically, it takes away the possibility that you can really sue them, that you can really sue anybody, because the only holders of the underlying images that were created by humans are Adobe themselves, or someone they've contracted or purchased the rights from. In sort of in a similar line, CodePilot has introduced a, as far as I know, still beta feature of code referencing, where you write some code using Copilot, and there's an option where it will show you this code was similar to this other code that a human wrote that was on GitHub, basically. But this is, Microsoft owns GitHub. They're making this code referencing thing. It's somewhat a surface thing. I feel it's somewhat facile. And also, it doesn't really necessarily express actual derivation. It's just the sort of thing you can do with a sort of code similarity analysis using whatever kind of technique. But it's always a reference to the code that they already basically control. Ideally under some sort of open source license, so maybe it's okay to use for this purpose, or maybe it's not. I'm going to go over this fairly quickly, but one of the things is that the things that are produced now by AIs, whether they're the productions of large language models, whether they're code or prose or images that are created by these generative models, can look a lot like things that are created by humans. It is becoming more difficult to distinguish those two kinds of things. So I think that there is an obligation of these machines to really identify themselves as what they are. Whatever we might say about the requirements for attribution or royalties or limitations on use of things that originate with humans, I think at very least there should be a requirement to acknowledge what's going on rather than make it easily hidden, the actual source of things. And then that brings us to one question. The answer you'll often hear is that what I just described, what I believe should be an ethical obligation upon the makers and sellers and so on of generative AI systems, is that it's just too technically difficult. We, sure, that would be great to do, but we don't really have the technology refined to do that, and that's simply untrue. And I'm going to show you in just a second here exactly why that's untrue. There's a couple categories. One is in images they're generated. And the technology of watermarking images is like 25 years old now. All of the stock image libraries and other kind of entities that are large cartels that hold many, many images, they watermark them already. And the technique they use to do that is actually really simple. What you do is, in a continuous tone image, such as a photograph or one that's generated by, like an art program, but that creates continuous tones, humans are not particularly good at recognizing very slight color variations in continuous tone ranges. So what you do is you just tweak those pixel values very slightly in particular select locations. And the particular locations within the few megapixels that are in an image can be selected in a kind of cryptographic way that's like a hash of the identity of the maker of the software and so on. But you can pick locations and make these modifications that are imperceptible to humans, and it will be distinctly identifiable as definitely belonging to that source. Whether that source is, the photograph that got into the stock image library, or whether it's the one that's generated by a particular machine. But we can actually do the same thing with text. In fact, we can do the same thing better with text, with more reliability. And this is, again, something that you'll read popular reports that this kind of technology would be very difficult, but there's actually a really excellent academic paper about exactly how you do this, which is at my first slide and at my end slide, there's a link to a blog that I write, and you can dig through that and find the citation easily enough. But basically, the idea is that you have a large language model. What a large language model does is simply predict the next token that will be produced in a particular sequence of words, basically. And then after it's produced that token, it makes a prediction for the next token and continually for each one until it's completed. It decides to stop. And what you can do is you can mark the potential next tokens with this red-green coloring. So it's not that the large language model is going to predict there's just one possible word that might follow the prompt that's been given or the particular partial completion that's occurred, but rather that there are many possibilities which have somewhat different probability distributions. So generally there's an algorithm like a softmax that's applied to the potential productions where the one that is the most likely next token is the one that's selected for the actual completion. So what you can do is just take the previous word, basically just perform a cryptographic hash on that previous word, perhaps salted with some identifier for the particular maker in order to uniqueify what the hash value will be, and then pick a next word that is either has the same or the opposite parity, the low order bit as the previous word. Now, in some cases, that is going to be a terrible choice. So you don't actually want to rule out categorically all of the red words, but rather you want to make them a little bit less likely and perhaps make the green words a little bit more likely. Remembering, red and green is just this coloration based on the cryptographic hash of the previous word. So imagine a couple prompts, and this is what I've been showing on screen. In the one case, the prompt might be President Barack, and then you're asking the machine to complete that sentence. It's extremely likely that the next word, the one that's going to create the lowest perplexity, is going to be Obama. The previous US president, who is very well known, of course. But there are other words that could follow Barack. Perhaps Hussein does. Perhaps, what do I have here? Adama and Ehud and Moshe, and who are some sports figures and writers and things like that. Apparently there's a Hungarian brand of brandy that's called Barack Brandy. So these are things that are conceivable as completions, but in the table that I created, which are just fabricated values, of course, I didn't actually run this through a specific machine, we imagined that the entropy is very low in this particular completion. So it's like overwhelmingly likely that Obama is going to be the next completion. So if you lower the probability of those red words by 0.01 or something like that, it's not going to change what the actual next word is. But in other cases, like if the sentence is, my name is, and then there are various names that might follow. In this case, this is taken from some, Anglo-American kind of names from the United States Census Bureau table of the most common names in some year, that sort of thing. But in any case, it might be of similar likelihood that the next word would be Michael or James or Mary or a variety of other things. So if you selectively nudge down the probability of, say, Michael occurring and James becomes the actual completion, it's not going to create perplexity in the readers because it's still a very natural seeming completion. And if you do this for every word that's produced, then you've put your thumb on the scale in a way that you get basically for every word of the sentence, there is a 50% chance that it could be randomly selected versus created by that machine. Well, if every one of those aligns with being the machine, the probability of flipping 100 heads in a row on a coin is very, very low. And this works even if you extract portions of the text, because it applies to any subpart of the text equally in terms of identifying the machine that perhaps produced this production, this artificial generation of a particular LLM. So there's really no way to tamper with it other than completely rewriting the content from start to finish, and then you're not really using the LLM production. There's a number of concerns that can come into what kind of what obligation machines have, these generative AI have, to the humans that contributed to the corpora that went into training them. And the thing that I'm almost out of time, I'll go quickly. The thing that comes up the most is people are concerned with copyrights. Like I should get a royalty because my book was scanned into the corpus that trained this machine, and the thing that was output resembled, or at least was derived from, my book. I don't really care about that very much, because in my mind, there's a trillion tokens that went into training this particular model. Okay, I contributed a few hundred or even a few million of those tokens. It's an insignificant fraction. So even under some sort of statutory scheme where it might be required that a royalty be paid, I'm going to get, my 100th of a penny or 1,000th of a penny or something as a royalty. I think that's not the interesting framework, except that it's interesting to copyright cartels. People like Disney, who own, all the films in the world, or Universal Music Group, who own all the music in the world, or a few publishers who own a great deal of the published works. Okay, they're getting a millionth of a cent at a time, but they own all the works, so it actually adds up to something. For me as an individual author, I mean, yeah, okay, maybe it's a fairness, but it's not one that I care about all that much. But I think that the thing that is interesting is historically to look at what is copyright. And there's a misperception, I think, by many, many creators, including those of us who write code, but also those of us who write books or music or paint paintings or whatever kind of creative things we do. The copyright was created to protect us in some sense. That's just not historically true. Copyright was created to protect publishers. It's, explicitly in law, starting from the 1703 Statute of Anne in the UK, and then following basically a similar precedent in other jurisdictions. It is something that is meant to protect big cartel interests, and any kind of secondary follow-on effect that actually indirectly protects some creators is sort of incidental to the purpose for which copyright exists. So I don't care about that because I don't care about capitalist interests. But there are a couple things I do care about. And is the next speaker here, or can I talk over a little bit? Is Emeka here? Okay, so I won't talk too much, but the things that I do care about are things like right to publicity and moral rights. I believe that my reputation as a human being, my moral standing in the world of creators and in the understanding of culture, regardless of that millionth of a cent that I might get as royalty or not, is actually something that's important. I don't want AIs to do something that either describe me in a defamatory light or even that utilize something without my name that is identifiably similar to the kind of things that I create that aren't the kind of representations of self that I would want to make. And this is something that's very jurisdiction specific in existing law, where, to make it simple, you basically don't have these kind of rights in the United States or in China, as it happens, but you basically do in the European Union, and you do in India, and South Korea and Argentina and Philippines and a variety of other countries. This is something where clearly there needs to be legislative unification. There needs to be cross-country agreements to reach a kind of common standard about what should exist in these kind of laws. But in this respect, I lean much closer to the EU framework than to the United States framework. And there's much else of the world, and I actually don't know the law in the Emirates about these kind of issues. So there's a bunch more, but I've already talked enough. So I'm going to skip through. Some of this is stuff that Authors Guild has said. The labeling, I talked about the bookmarking, not the watermarking kind of thing. There's some cases that are that have existed. There is this issue of availability over time, but where I think it's worth mentioning this concept of, does it matter whether the training corpus actually had the work that went into creation of something that was substantially similar to a work of mine? And the answer could be yes or no. I mean, it might be that because a lot of culture is common to many of us, that it couldn't quite accidentally create a Mertz-like book or paragraph or code segment, even if I wasn't concretely in the training set. Does that nonetheless create an obligation of the machine towards me? I was going to go into some technical things about how you would measure those things, but I'm out of time, so I won't. But nonetheless, basically everything I've been talking about is not really this link. I've barely started at creating this framework where you could more formally specify attribution that would probably be something like RDF. But if you look at the blog site that's listed in the final slide there, I discuss like all these same things in much more detail, and I encourage people to read that and to write me at the email address and ask me more questions and so on.
Thanks, David. I think we don't have enough time for questions, but if you want to talk to David, you can reach him out around.
Please do. I'm around. I'm one of the advisors for the conference. I'll be around always. So please talk to me more in the hall. I guess we have Emeka now, so we actually have a chance to have another wonderful speaker.
Thanks again.